Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel. Today, we are so happy to speak with you about anti-Asian racism in Canada and also to honor Asian communities in Asian History Month at the Lincoln Alexander School of Law. We wanted to start with a land acknowledgement, and I do this as the Assistant Dean of Students at Ryerson's Faculty of Law, and it's something we take very seriously here, because so often we can do these acknowledgements and they're just performative and we're reading something. But for us, it has great meaning. And we open with this land acknowledgement so that we can recognize where we are, the lands on which we reside, and the people that are protectors and keepers of this land. A close friend and colleague at Ryerson, Serena Johnson, always says, when Indigenous people acknowledge the land, we are acknowledging the trees that let us breathe and the water and fish that give us sustenance. We are acknowledging the actual land. When non-Indigenous people, settlers and immigrants are acknowledging the land, we're acknowledging the people of this land. And so I do that with great respect. And I say Toronto and Ryerson University are in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe people, the Mississauga, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them together to share the territory and protect the land. We say that subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Chi-miigwech. Thank you very much for joining us here today. And to open our event, I want to welcome Dean Donna Young to share a few words with us. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about her. She is my boss, and she is the inaugural Dean of the Faculty of Law at Ryerson University, which is the Lincoln Alexander School of Law now, as of May 2021. We're very proud of that name and to carry the honor that comes with Lincoln Alexander. Prior to joining Ryerson, Dean Young was actually the President William McKinley Distinguished Professor of Law and Public Policy at Albany Law School in the United States. She worked there for several decades, and she was a joint faculty member at the University of Albany's Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Department. Her areas of interest, which come out in all of her work, in the pillars that have founded our law school, in her everyday practice, show an interest in inequality, and specifically inequity and emphasis on legal treatment of race and gender discrimination in our countries. Since joining our law school, Dean Young's vision has been such a fundamental part of what has moved us ahead. And she's been recognized in very important ways. Just last week, she was recognized as the 2021 Female Trailblazer Award recipient at the Canadian Law Awards. She was the recipient in 2021 in Canada of the Top 25 Women of Influence Award. She's a recipient of 2021 Kate Stoneman Awards at Albany Law School, and she was recognized in Toronto Life in 2020 as one of the most influential Torontonians, and I have to agree. In terms of when we thought about putting this panel together and the importance of it, we both wanted to honor Asian Canadians and talk about the reality of anti-Asian racism that we are seeing spiking in our country and North America and globally in COVID and in the pandemic. And I wanted to just highlight two of Dean Young's past involvements in this kind of work. So she was actually someone who articled in a feminist labor law firm where she worked on cases in female-led unions, and she saw really unique experiences that affected women in the workplace, and especially racialized women, many of which identify as Asian Canadians. She was also a consultant when she first started at the Ontario Human Rights Commission, where she examined how race discrimination was handled by Ontario Human Rights Commission. And in that capacity, she saw that the majority of complaints that the commission was seeing was brought by Black and Asian Canadians, both for communities that were targeted by their otherness in Canada. And we're going to talk about that a lot in this panel. So I welcome you, Dean Donna Young, to please open us up today.
Thank you so much, Dean Mello. That was a lovely introduction. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Judge Marika Omatsu, who will introduce you to our distinguished panelists. But before I do, I want to highlight that this event is the first that our law school has hosted since our official naming ceremony on May 6th, when we became the Lincoln Alexander School of Law. And since we received a very generous donation in support of our racial justice initiative from our chancellor, Janice Fukakusa. All three of these events, the donation, the renaming, and this event today, are groundbreaking for us as they help to establish our commitment to combating racial hatred in all its forms. Lincoln Alexander would have been delighted to know that the ceremony to announce the law school's new name, the establishment of our Racial Justice Initiative, and this event today have all taken place during Asian Heritage Month. Mr. Alexander was a leader in the fight against racial injustice in Canada in all its forms and operated the first multiracial law firm in Hamilton in the early 1960s, in which there were 4 lawyers. One was Indigenous, one was a Japanese Canadian man, and one who was white, and one who was Black. I think it's a fitting tribute to his legacy that we are celebrating our namesake by showing our commitment to the values and principles that he held so dear. I would like to thank especially our Asia Pacific Law Students Association, who have worked tirelessly over the past year as members of our first cohort of students, and who somehow found the time and energy to help us organize this event in what turned out to be one of the most challenging years that many of us have experienced for so many reasons, one reason being the topic of today's discussion, anti-Asian discrimination in Canada. I also want to thank them especially for sponsoring our newest entrance award, the Apulsa Leadership Award, for incoming Lincoln Law students who self-identify as Asian, who demonstrate financial need, and who have shown leadership in their communities. To all of you in attendance today, I encourage you to contribute to this award by visiting our giving page on the law school's website and designating your donation to this award. And now I would like to welcome Judge Maryka Omatsu. 28 years ago, when Marika Omatsu was appointed a judge, she was the first East Asian woman to hold this position. Before this honor, Judge Omatsu was a lawyer for 16 years, practiced human rights, environmental, and criminal law. She worked for all levels of government. She taught in Toronto, China, and Japan, and she chaired the Ontario Human Rights Appeals Tribunal and adjudicated for the Ontario Law Society. Judge Omatsu was on the National Association of Japanese Canadians strategy and negotiation team that won redress in 1988 for her community. Her book, Bittersweet Passage, documented that struggle and won the Prime Minister's Award for Publishing and the Laura Jameson Prize for Best Feminist Book. Her 2018 video, Swimming Upstream, sets out the Japanese Canadian case to redress from the British Columbia government. In 2021, Judge Omatsu was one of the writers on Challenging Racist British Columbia, 150 Years and Counting. Most recently, Judge Omatsu has been named to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, the Special Advisory Council, and the NAJC's Steering Committee for BC Redress. She was awarded the Order of Ontario in 2015, the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association Trailblazer of the Year Award in 2013, and the Federation of Asian Canadian Lawyers Lifetime Achievement Award in 2010. In 2019, Judge Omatsu was the recipient of Ryerson University's Honorary Doctorate of Laws. And I'm actually delighted to announce that last fall, the law school acquired a beautiful portrait of Judge Omatsu by the artist Pat Cleary. And as some of you know, the law school right now sits in a newly renovated space in Ryerson. And we've got a lot of empty white walls right now. And I'd like to just let everyone know that this portrait is the very first piece of art that we have acquired. And it was the portrait of Judge Omatsu. So I really, really welcome you, Judge Omatsu, and I will turn it over to you right now. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning all. And such kind words. Thank you, Dean Young. I'm so pleased to be with you today. And we have such a stellar panel. I have the easy job of introducing these wonderful people and then moderating some questions. First, and I'm going alphabetically, is Dr. Toni or Toni de Mello. Toni is a human rights lawyer and holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Waterloo and a master's degree in public policy and urban and regional planning from Princeton University, law degrees from McGill University. She's recently completed a PhD at the University of Toronto. She's definitely an overachiever. Toni has over 20 years of experience working with businesses, government, and nonprofit organizations. And for the last 12 years, she has focused her work in human rights. She's worked as a senior consultant in business across North America and Europe, and served in the United Nations in Geneva, Senegal in West Africa, and Colombia in South America. She was the director of human rights at Ryerson University for 4 years and is now the assistant dean, student programming, development, and equity at Ryerson's Lincoln Alexander School of Law. Next is my old friend, Avvy Go. Avvy is the clinic director of the Chinese and Southeast Asia Legal Clinic. For the last 30 years, since 1991, she has worked exclusively in the legal clinic system, serving the legal needs of low-income individuals and families, the majority of whom are non-English speaking immigrants and refugees. Avvy has published widely and given numerous lectures and educational seminars in various areas of law, dealing among other issues with immigrants and racialized communities. Avvy spends much of her time doing community organizing and advocacy work. In fact, we often wonder how she has that many hours in a day. She has received several awards, including the Urban Alliance on Race Relations Justice Award in 2020, the Okazi Life Achievement Award in 2018, the Senate of Canada 150 Medal in 2017, the Order of Ontario in 2014, and the Federation of Asian Canadians Lawyers Lawyer of Distinction Award in 2012. Thirdly is Shalini Konanur. Shalini is the Executive Director and Lawyer of the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario, SALCO. She has worked in Ontario's legal aid clinic system for the past 20 years and is actively involved in several areas of poverty law reform. She participates in extensive advocacy to address racism in Canada. This includes presentations at the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the United Nations General Assembly, and advisory roles with the Toronto Police and the province on racism and policing in Ontario. Shalini also spearheads SALCO's test casework, challenging issues of racial, gender, and religious discrimination at the Supreme Court of Canada, the Ontario Court of Appeal, and the Federal Court. And lastly, Vincent Wong. Vincent is a PhD candidate at Osgoode Hall Law School, where he researches racial capitalism and its relationship to undocumented youth experiences with education and employment in Canada. He's also a research associate at the African American Policy Forum, where he co-leads the Truth Be Told campaign against the suppression of anti-racist education and ideas. Previously, and this is how they all seem to intersect, Vincent was a staff lawyer at the Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic and secretary of the Chinese Canadian National Council, Toronto chapter. Thank you and welcome, panelists. We have 4 questions this morning, and I'm going to try and rein you in to about 15 minutes a question, because I know you have all wonderful things and interesting, important things to add to each of these questions. So the first question, and we're directing it initially Toni, Dean Toni, question. We are witnessing an acceleration of anti-Asian racism during the COVID crisis. How do we make sense of this and how do we respond to it? Over to you.
Thank you so much, Justice Omatsu. So I want to tackle this question looking at first, what do we mean by Asian? Because we say anti-Asian, and what do we mean by that? And we're talking about a massive continent, right? But very often when people are thinking about Asian, we're thinking Chinese or Northeast Asian, and sometimes we'll say Southeast Asian when we mean India. So we talk about China and India, but there are a myriad of countries, Bhutan, Thailand, Taiwan, Bangladesh, that we often aren't speaking about. And we talk about Asia as a big kind of unit, and this can be homogenizing. And so when we're talking about anti-Asian racism right now in Canada and North America in general, what we're actually talking about is what is anti-Chinese racism. And so I'm going to get to that, but first I'm going to talk about anti-Asian racism in general. And I think this homogenization of one of the reasons we say anti-Asian, but we're actually talking about anger, hatred that is targeted towards Chinese Canadians, is because often people will say, I don't know the difference between somebody from China and somebody from Korea. I don't know the difference between somebody from Bangladesh and somebody from India, right? I don't know that difference. And so we say Asian, and that whole community experiences either blame or praise as a group. And I think that that homogenization is part of the problem that we have, because what we're seeing is that we tend to essentialize Asian communities into a binary of either highly successful, where we say we've seen many Asian communities, different ones have a lot of success in business, in community organizing, in integration into communities. And we say, look, they're doing so well, right? The term model minority that we use often for Asian communities to say, oh, this is what you should be, is actually a term that came up to say, well, look at how well the Japanese did. They actually suffered from internment camps, but they were still able to rise and do well in business. And we've seen such high levels of success, but we're talking about one community and we call them the model minority. So what does that mean for other communities that are racialized? Other communities that might be considered minorities? How is that idea of, what I call the good Asian, the Asian that comes to work and works hard, the Asian that never complains no matter what you say, the Asian that we love to think of as subservient and quiet and working into the night, right? All of this came out in my research when I was looking at the ways in which racialized people experience hiring and integration to the job market in law. What we saw was that essentializing, that you could be this model minority, perfect Asian that works hard and never complains, but that both kind of pits Asian people into you have to be that. And it also becomes an othering of, well, what other communities aren't? How are Black communities not model? How are Indigenous communities not model? How are Latinx communities in the US not seen as model minorities? So that's created a lot of problems around anti-Asian racism in general in our communities, but also within racialized communities where there's been sort of that tension that arises from that. I also want to say that it isn't new. We're talking about an acceleration, but it is an unveiling of anti-Asian racism that is deeply entrenched into Canadian history and to Canadian society. So we had everything from in 1885, we had a Chinese head tax, where to come to China, to Canada as a person from China, you had to pay an amount of money to be here. That then to come as a laborer, tens of thousands came as laborers and were paid a third to half of what their counterparts were paid. So one, coming and having to pay to come because you're Chinese. It was a policy that was put into place to discourage Chinese folks from coming. And what it actually discouraged was their families from coming. So we had laborers come and then be separated from their families. What is it to have a history where during the World War II, we interned Japanese Canadians and told them that you are seen as a threat to Canadian community, and then they became othered. And one of the things we've seen in anti-Asian racism that is unique and important to discuss is it's not a sense that you're Canadian, but you're seen as lesser. So many of my friends that work in the United States and in Canada will talk about how Black folks will be considered lesser, but American. Indigenous folks are considered lesser, but founders in Canadian and US communities. But when you're Asian and that racism comes out, it often comes out as you're a foreigner. You are other, you are not from here. You are never Canadian, no matter how many generations. And I think that this is something important because what happens then that leads to the violence that we're seeing now that's escalating is that when you're seen as other, anything that happens that's wrong, you've brought and you are to blame. So when the virus came in, we weren't looking at Italy to say, well, Italian Canadians, let's look at them and see what's happening. The virus is rampant in Italy. But Chinatown was a ghost town. We were blaming Chinese Canadians and Asian Canadians. When the swine flu happened in the US, we didn't call it the American flu. But there are people calling it the Chinese virus. There are people that are targeting and yelling at Chinese folks and blaming them for that. So there's a sense of blame that comes because you are not one of us. And the last thing that I'll say that I think is important before I open it up to my colleagues is the binary is so incredibly dangerous because we think, well, we're saying good things. We're saying that Asian people are good at math. We're saying they're hardworking. We're saying you're successful. But if you're Asian and you're not those things, if you're not good at math and you're Asian, you bear a brunt of that. If you are an Asian person working, and specifically what I saw in my doctoral research, if you're working in law and you are an Asian person, Asian woman, and you speak up, if you don't agree, if you're somebody who talks and thinks and acts like I do, you're not seen as that model, quiet, lovely, subservient, and you get penalized for that. In fact, often you're not welcome in, and when you come in, you're asked to leave. And I'll end by saying what we've seen is an increase in violence in Canada that we need to talk about. So just this week, The Guardian, which is not even a Canadian paper, so we need to talk about that too, by the way, that what is happening in terms of Asian racism is not being seen by our own countries and not being named by our own country. The Guardian, a British paper, had to say that Vancouver is now the #1 city for anti-Asian racism in all of North America. And what we have seen is a 717% increase in violence against Asian Canadians and primarily Chinese Canadians. So let me note that as well. And so I want to mention that this is actually resulting in physical harm to people. We've had students, staff, and faculty tell me they're being yelled at, they're being threatened with violence, they're scared to come back on campus when it's deemed safe because of the pandemic, because they're worried about their lives. And so we need to talk about that in Canada. And while I think it's super important that we have reacted to the fact that 6 Asian American women were murdered by a white supremacist, we need to think about what's also happening in Canada, in our country, and name it.
I'd like to invite the other panelists to jump in, please.
Maybe I'll start. And I absolutely agree with everything that Toni has just said. Maybe just a couple of additional points, like, the perpetual foreigner, concept, right? And in the context of not just the virus, but at the same time, we are seeing, of course, many of us are engaged in discussions about the human rights violations in China, and then as well as Hong Kong, but at the same time, we are also worried about being, I guess, wrapped up in that rising anti-China sentiment, that we are often being asked to pledge our loyalty to Canada, including someone like Dr. Teresa Tam, right? Somehow her support for WHO is being labeled as someone who is for the China, working for China as opposed to working for Canada. And I think also the whole perpetual foreigner, as well as the yellow peril, that's another historical kind of legacy of the exclusion. In fact, back in 1885, we had a Royal Commission on Immigration just for the Chinese immigrants. And it talks about how Chinatown was hotbed for diseases. And those concept of Chinese being unsanitary, they're not assimilable, is used for an excuse not to give them the right to vote and to exclude them from entering Canada. So all of those have an impact today. And the model minority concept, to me, it also masks the very real existence of anti-Asian racism in Canada, right? By saying that these people are model minority, therefore there's no discrimination against them, right? And even the concept of, people are good in math, like, I'm not good in math. I think that the real implication is not so much we're good in math, but that you are only good in math. So you can only be accountant or, whatever, like, things that require math, and you should not be lawyer, you should not be CEO, like, you're smart but not smart enough, like, you don't have those skill set that requires you to do anything else other than math. So that's my view.
If we have time, I just wanted to extend on the comments of Avvy and Tanya, which I absolutely wholeheartedly agree with. And one thing that we've been grappling with at the South Asian Legal Clinic is the ways in which our communities will identify not necessarily as Asian, right? And Canada has made a distinction, even in the way it collects data with this term South Asian, which is actually sort of a put upon construct because the communities you're talking about are much broader than that. But what I really wanted to talk about very quickly is the role in which media and public dialogue has been perpetuating anti-Asian racism, anti-South Asian racism. And to crystallize it, most recently, Canada had massive coverage of the travel bans to India and Pakistan. And we did some work on what doing that would do to communities here. And we've seen the fallout in the calls that we get of being blamed now within South Asian communities here as the people who are spreading virus. Even just this morning, I heard a story about Australia going into lockdown because somebody came back from India and spread a variant, even though that person did everything that was required of them. So that type of coverage has actually continually shown us from the calls that we're getting that South Asian communities around Ontario, and I suspect around the country, are getting the blame for spreading COVID and are getting results. So we hear the same stories. People being spit on, people being yelled at for going to work, people being yelled at for being our low-wage essential workers, people being yelled at for living in multiple homes. All of these things are a result of the systemic racism and that has created those situations in the first place, but no recognition. And so I think part of, and all of this has pre-existed. All of those sentiments have pre-existed, but part of what is happening right now is that we have not been purposeful in the way in which words and coverage impact those communities, right? The way in which news covers things, where they think that they're very neutrally just reporting things, in fact, are not neutral, right? The words, the communities they are addressing are creating those situations as well and raising that hatred, which is really a difficult thing to respond to.
I'll just add in really quickly because I'm really glad that Avvy flagged the geopolitical portion of it, because this is the thing that I think is really in the background and that's really hard to talk about because people don't really know how to talk about it. Insofar as, you know, anti-Asian racism, especially during COVID, has been part and parcel of a weaponization of geopolitical like tensions and scares, right? A campism, a sort of clash of civilizations, geopolitical kind of new Cold War binary that's happening. And this is really harmful in so far as that the view that China is like so fundamentally and irreconcilably different from any powerful economic state that it would, you know, not have its own, you know, kind of problems. It would, you know, it's kind of similar Islamophobia, ethno-nationalism, right? These are all things that we have to talk about together as, you know, society, as opposed to this extremely harmful campus, either your free world or your, you know, like it doesn't even make any sense. But campuses are using that and ratcheting up the geopolitical tension as a justification for ramping up anti-Asian racism, as a justification for saying, hey, either you are this model minority, both in the sense of a Canadian patriotic national, or you are a foreign national and also a Chinese spy, right? So I think that part has to be unpacked, and it's a difficult one to unpack.
Thank you, panelists. This is addressed to the audience. The last 30 minutes, so from 12:30 to 1, there will be some Q&A. And so if you have any, please put them in the Q&A box for the panelists. And Pulsa will be moderating the Q&A. So moving on to question 2, and this will be directed to Avvy. What is the role of law and the legal profession in challenging anti-Asian and other forms of racism? What does the STOP, SOP, Statement of Principles, and the Full Stop movement reveal about the capacities of the legal profession to rise to the challenge? Over to you, Avvy.
Okay, so I understand that not everyone knows about the Stop movement, what this is about. And I guess I have to go back a few years just to give some context. So basically around, I would say 2012, 2013, the Law Society, which is the governing body for all the lawyers in Ontario, they formed a Challenges Racialized Licensees Task Force to address the concerns raised by racialized lawyers about their experience of discrimination and racism in the profession. So basically, they're over the years, like there are more and more, there's a growing number of racialized people entering the legal profession. Many more racialized lawyers were becoming benchers. So at that time, I was a bencher as well. So we decided to form the task force. And one of the first things we did was actually conduct a survey, and where racialized lawyers, both racialized and non-racialized, were surveyed. And it shows that racialization really is a constant and persistent factor affecting racialized licensees. And it also a major factor in shaping their career choices and outcomes of their career. So it's like a huge issue. And we also did consultation with some legal organizations such as FACO. It came out with a report and also with 13 recommendations to the Law Society, which, among other things, tell law firms to collect data, have equity plan. There's some recommendations for the Law Society. One of the recommendations was this statement of principle that every single licensee in Ontario will have to sign on when they file their annual report. You basically just check off the box, literally. But then 1 year after the recommendation was adopted by the convocation, one of the benchers says, based on, as a conscientious objector, he is opposed to that statement of principle. At that time, he tried to bring it down. He was unsuccessful. And then in the following election of benchers, because benchers are elected by lawyers in the profession, a whole Stop Soft campaign was launched by a number of lawyers who are basically anti-equity. And they were successful in electing 21 benchers and tried to take it down. And in the end, they did remove the mandatory requirement of the statement of principle. So now this same people and their supporters are calling on a full stop campaign. Basically, they try to get rid of all the racial equity kind of measures that the Law Society is undertaking. So to me, it's very problematic. Of course, as a former bencher, we fought very hard to get the Law Society acknowledge that systemic racism exists in Canadian society, and to suggest, basically the underlying premise of these people is that there is no racism, there's no systemic racism in the profession, therefore we don't need the statement. And we just talked about the anti-Asian racism today and anti-Black racism. I mean, you can't imagine that, everything like in the rest of the society, this is happening, but not in the legal profession. It's just nonsense, right? But also, I think particularly for Asian Canadians, it's more problematic, as Toni and others has said. We tend not to accept that there is anti-Asian racism. So for the Law Society to say that there's no racism, that would just make it even harder for Asian Canadians to fight against it. So I think it's really a very important issue, particularly if you're lawyers. We are supposed to uphold the rule of law. We are supposed to abide by, Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom, bring these kind of principles to our practice. And yet we're allowing a bunch of benchers, elected no less, to undermine all those important principles by getting rid of this very simple requirement for you to take off the box. I'm sorry, it's just ridiculous. That's why I think it's very important that for the next election, we elect benchers who will support equity principles. I have told Shalini I'll be her campaign manager when she runs for the bencher in 2023. And people should really start thinking about the 2023 election at the Law Society.
Please jump in, panelists.
Well, thank you for agreeing to run my campaign that I haven't agreed to launch. And I do want to let people know that I did run in the last Venture election, and I did lose, and I ran on a very strong equity platform. And what I think is disheartening about what's happening at the Law Society of Ontario is that it may also be a reflection of a backlash against equity in other spaces and places. I think about my sister, who's a psychologist and is facing a similar backlash at the Ontario Psychology Association around not wanting to put in an equity framework. So I don't think we're alone in terms of professions that are pushing back. And Avvy and I and many other people probably on this panel and at this appointment work with racialized licensees, people who are wanting to come into the legal profession as legal workers, paralegals, law students. We work with sole practitioners. We work with the groups of racialized lawyers who are most marginalized. So we hear every day about the levels of systemic racism that we face as racialized licensees. I work in what people would think of as one of the more progressive workspaces, the clinic system. And we can tell you it is not progressive, right? And Avvy's air quoting it absolutely. The plain truth is we do not have employment equity within the system. We do not have pay equity within the system. And we are meant to be seen as one of the most progressive spaces. It is disheartening at its very core that a profession that is supposed to embody our Charter of Rights and Freedoms and our human rights codes. And in my view, a profession who has a responsibility to place those at the framework of how they practice law is moving backwards in terms of not even wanting to recognize that we have racism within the profession itself. A profession that will recognize and say that there's racism in the justice system, but just not in this part of the justice system. And going back to Justice Omatsu's starting question, I believe that no matter where you work in the legal profession, you can always incorporate social justice into your work. You can be a tax lawyer who thinks about the underlying systemic oppressions. You can work on a Bay Street firm and convince your firm to fund test casework for underserved and disadvantaged communities. It is our responsibility, it's our privilege, but in my opinion, also our duty to advance that in our work.
Yeah, real quick, just jump on and thanks Avvy and Shalini for taking us all back to this terrible sordid history of Stop Stop. But I just wanted to flag how I think this is an evolution, right, of the campaign. When we had Stop Statement of Principles as a electoral slate, I can imagine if anti-racism is your number one political platform, but I guess it is. This is an evolution, right? This is Full Stop is the mask off moment for Stop Stop. And I think as my classmate and I guess incoming faculty member at Lincoln Law, Joshua Seeley Harrington put it, Stop Stop was vaguely free speech in form, right? But it was clearly anti-equality in substance, okay? So Full Stop is anti-equality in substance and it's anti-free speech in form. So if you don't get it, if for whatever reason you didn't get the memo before, you should get the memo now, right? This is the same thing that we're seeing quite frankly in the States with the anti-CRT campaigning and bans on anti-racist education is anti-racism being fit in as the new racism and a demonization of all sort of anti-racist education, the codification of essentially white fragility as a basis for creating laws or creating guidelines and policy. And it's just completely, it's not insane, right? Because you can understand it, but this is really the new landscape for racial justice battles after the racial reckoning of the summer of 2020. If there's a way to make a movement disappear, it's by restricting the ability for people to talk about it, restricting the ability for people to identify racial injustice. And if you can't identify racial injustice, you can't talk about it, then there's nothing you can do about racial justice. And that's the game right now.
What I want to add is sort of thinking about why we care about this so much. There are many people on this Zoom that aren't in the legal profession that have dialed in. And I can tell you, anyone who knows me is surprised that I decided to work in a faculty of law. I am somebody who cares deeply about social justice. And when I went to law school, I was both informed and educated and deeply disappointed. And I was disappointed because I thought, what is this apparatus we have to teach people to find justice that has resulted in so few people finding justice, that has resulted in systems where people feel that based on how much money you have, your race, where you live, you will have access or no access to justice. And then I went to see all these lawyers that I thought would be like in the movies, caring about changing access to justice. And law schools were so white and the professors were so white and so elitist and rich. And all I learned about was property law and how to protect property. And I was thinking, what about all the folks that don't have access to property to begin with? And we've seen this as something that is plaguing our legal education system. And the reason I think everybody on this Zoom needs to care is because the legal profession is running the country. More than 75% of our prime ministers have had a legal background. People that are working in major corporations, people that are working in NGOs, people that are working in community justice. The folks that have a legal background also have a lot of power in our community. So the reason I'm in this law school is because I believe we have to change the face of who is running our country and who is at the front lines helping people get access to justice, which all of us are recognizing more and more, especially in COVID. It's been magnified that not only are our systems not working, they are literally targeting the very people that we claim they are there to protect. Right? The murder of George Floyd, now almost exactly a year ago today, right? It was this week, was for people, we needed to watch a video to believe what we've been hearing for decades, that Black people are dying at the hands of the people that are meant to protect us, right? Not in the absence and negligence, which is also happening and we're seeing from COVID, but at the hands of those people. And I think the reason this is important for the full stop motion is what Avvy said is so important. It's the most basic statement. It's a checkbox to say, I care about diversity. I'll do something representing anything. And there is a group of people that are saying, we do not want to sign up for this. And I say every lawyer or legal student that is on this call, you need to care about this. And the other thing you said, Avvy, that I think is so important is that so much of the problem around anti-Asian racism is general apathy. Nobody cares. They're like, come on, you're doing fine. Right? And first of all, doing fine means certain communities, Bhutanese Americans and Canadians aren't doing as well as Japanese Canadians, Chinese Canadians, Indian Canadians. So we need to know that there is a bifurcation of both people at the top of the ranks and a lot of people in service professions. In Canada, the idea, because of federal programs, is that Filipino Canadians should be taking care of our kids as a pathway to becoming nurses. So if you want to be a nurse, you can come from the Philippines, but you need to take care of a Canadian family's children for 2 years. That's like telling somebody, you want to be an engineer. I need you to live in a Canadian house and take care of a Canadian family's car for a couple of years, but that's a pathway, you're welcome, right? So thinking about what it means that we need to start caring about this stuff, not when it hits somebody getting murdered because they're Asian or being kicked, but rather what does it mean in every one of our professions to talk about how we don't need these basic statements that we checkbox, but we need all leaders now. And I do this with law firms all the time to say, I am going to take an active involvement to measure the ways in which Asian Canadians are not only coming in, but are supported, advance, have roles where they're promoted, and also start speaking out against this. And I tell you, if you are not Asian, not racialized, this is your moment to speak out with vigor, zest, and passion. It is a time people are listening. And please speak out about the fact that we want our community, our legal community, to be more representative and more inclusive.
Thank you, panelists. We're moving on to the third question, and the lead person will be Vincent. Question. Anti-Asian racism has always been a part of Canadian nation building. What can we learn from the histories that have been erased and ignored? And how does this history affect cross-racial and Indigenous solidarity? Vincent.
Well, thank you for framing this question this way. It's really profound. And well, I guess with the last part, while I have the mic for a sec, I'd like to just say a word about, Lincoln Law at X University, right? And in this particular context and in this particular institution, it's absolutely incumbent on us as settlers, right? As non-Indigenous peoples, who absolutely have a positive obligation to actualize truth and reconciliation, to acknowledge the legacy of Egerton Ryerson and his role as one of the principal architects of the genocidal Indian residential school system. Now, the research, the information, the history, that's all been done. It's all out there. There's no need for further collection of information, only a further collection of political will and community power, okay? So I just want to begin my remarks in response to that question about cross-racial solidarity and Indigenous community and allyship is full support for Indigenous students at X University to change the name of Ryerson, which continues to stand as a symbol of cultural genocide and intergenerational trauma, right? Not just for Indigenous people, but the entire community, right? Entire community. And as you'll see, when I'm going to get into the history now a little bit, as much as an amateur historian like myself can, is this is intertwined with our discussion about anti-Asian racism, right? In here in Canada. And so, to the question then, I think, I would argue that we sometimes tell this history wrong, right? Often when we tell the history of anti-Asian racism, it falls prey to this narrow, seemingly linear, single-axis narrative, right? We get a couple of dates, a couple of humiliating racist laws and policies. They ultimately get overturned after World War II, and ultimately we begin this transition to like a post-racial society after multiculturalism. So to the extent that anti-Asian racism really pops up, right, in this kind of, for example, COVID, for SARS, it's like an aberration that shocks us and results in some, questions about, oh, how could this have happened? But it shouldn't shock us. And to the extent that it does, it means that we are telling the history wrong, right? So, part of my dissertation is trying to examine, and I do think this is the case, that racial capitalism is a key lens, a governing logic by which to understand anti-Asian racism, specifically in Canadian immigration law, right? And that creation of the racialization, we always talk about it. It's like, what is the meaning of Asian, right? Like in this context, it has no meaning, right? It's like J. Caspian Kang. I believe Asian American as a concept is like no meaning. And to a certain extent, he's right? But it's doing work. And if you look at the history of Canadian immigration since Confederation, even slightly before, you'll understand what it's doing. And for racial capitalism, I'm using a working definition here from Professor Athena Matua, which is a global system of extraction that relies on and structures a racialized division of labor, okay? Division of labor. And it does two things. It's deployed, right? This racial hierarchy making is deployed for one, greater profits than would be possible without racism, and two, to stabilize capitalism, at least in the short run, okay? And so in this, it's important to recognize race. I think when we discuss, this is not just anti-Asian racism, but as a verb as opposed to a noun. This is a process, right? And it shifts over time depending on the context. And racial imaginaries are used against Asians, right? And created to perpetuated through the immigration law, through the racialized imaginary of border making in Canada. So how is this tied to Indigenous folks? How is this tied to settler colonialism? So immigration actually played an enormous role in settler colonial capitalism, especially in the 1850s to the 1900s. Canada was expanding west. It needed to install immigrant farmers from Europe, assign them rights, enclose their own, here's where the private property comes in, their own land, and uphold those land rights against Indigenous resistance, right? Often with coercive state power. So Indigenous land was literally converted into private white settler capital. And to facilitate this project, you need immigrants, right? Because you can't have cops like everywhere, you can't have militia everywhere, it's too big. So you actually need immigrants to come in. And this is a time, an era where I say, this is when Canadian immigration was white, 1867 to about 1880. Right? And if you look at the immigration laws at that time, we essentially have an open door policy. very protective of immigrants' welfare, financial supports, there were immigration halls, there was active recruitment. The Asian question comes in at 1880s, right? So you have the first kind of non-white set of immigrants, which were the Chinese laborers, and they are the first non-whites to go through this new immigration system. They're the temporary foreign workers of our time. And the railway was key to the settler colonial project. It was way cheaper to transport white settlers if you have this railway and everything that they would need. So BC made joining Canada contingent on this building of the railway. And the person who was contracted to do this, Andrew Onderdonk, realized that the only way that this was going to happen is if we have mad cheap labor, right? We don't have that surplus pool of labor in the enslaved Black population as you have in the States. So you have to bring them in somewhere. And that's where the 15,000 first Chinese laborers came in. And that's where racial capitalism itself created the term of Asiatics, right? So Chinese, well, what does Chinese have to do with, the Japanese? What does Chinese have to do with Sikhs from the Punjab area? It's literally created in this first generation of immigration laws. So I know I'm talking a lot. I'll say, one last thing is that, as Toni mentioned, others, Chinese workers were paid much less, were given the most dangerous tasks, died, by the dozens. And due to the harsh conditions that they faced, like many were sort of left to die at the sides of these, kind of railway construction projects. And some First Nations people actually took in and nursed some of the Chinese railway workers that were left to die back to health. These workers sometimes intermarried into First Nations communities that are on the West Coast. And Bill Chu, if you look it up, does a lot of great histories of this, kind of erased era. But once the last spike was put in, the need for labor ceased, and immigration law immediately then switched to restrict Chinese migration, right? And at the same time, labor unions all banned Chinese people, first by banning Chinese people, then by banning the idea of Asiatics. As more South Asians came, as more Japanese labor came, especially in 1907 to build the Grand Trunk Railway. And that led to then the big kind of anti-Asian riot in 1907. So I'm done with the history now, but my only point is to say we have to understand these histories, not in a linear fashion, but thinking about how race is being produced. Race doesn't come out of like a social vacuum, right? It's deployed to do something. And if we can tell the history of what it's trying to do, we can understand now, why we have anti-Asian racism nowadays and the work that it's doing. So I'll just stop there.
We have about 1 minute left on this question. Would anyone like to say a closing word?
Can I really quickly pick up on two pieces? One, I think Canada has done a very poor job of teaching our young people about the history of different Asian communities. There is a lack of information. But two, I think Vince's points on the tie-in historically of immigration and anti-Asian racism are as true then as they are now. The current system of immigration is systemically and inherently structured to be racist. It is racist against Black communities. It is racist against Asian communities. We push many of those people in the current system to temporary status or out of status positions. We keep their permanent residence precarious by criminal inadmissibility. So the reality is the history mirrors exactly what is going on right now in terms of immigration and the way it plays out as racism for these communities.
Thank you. For our last question, which is question 4, each of you have been deeply involved in advocacy, activism, and resistance on many fronts of social justice. How has advocacy changed over the generations? And what do you see as the greatest barriers and opportunities you face today? And Shalini, please begin.
so much. I'm going to keep my remarks actually a little bit shorter because I think that this is a great point for everybody to jump in on. And hopefully we'll have some Q&A time too. So when I was thinking about this question, I think the reality is the thing that has changed in terms of advocacy is the introduction of social media and the internet. And so the way in which advocacy happens now is much more significantly impacted by the way in which social media plays a role and the internet plays a role in the proliferation of information and advocacy. So while, we still have, advocacy in the traditional sense, lawyers still do test cases, we still do law reform, activists still lobby, we still do protests and campaigns. The reality is the way in which you can pressure through social media has impacted the response from decision makers, from private corporations, from governments, from all sorts of players. And I think it presents opportunities and barriers. So there are goods and bads out of that advancement of technology. Certainly some of the easier ones to highlight are the idea that people with a simple cell phone can videotape some of the atrocities that are happening and shed light and give proof to things that we always knew were happening. But somehow the ability for people to see those things happening has incited more advocacy. And we've seen that in lots of ways, right? The ability to access campaigns and access information has exponentially grown. So if I think back to my time pre-internet and what I knew about the world and what I knew was happening in my time now, I know much more. Do I always know the right? That's a big question, right? But the reality is we do know much more. We actually can be connected more globally and across geography on things that are important to all of us, which is really, really great. I think, though, that the downside of all of this is that those same platforms have also allowed for the widespread proliferation of hate without accountability. The ability to express discriminatory views, the ability to express hate from a sort of anonymous or non-accountable way has grown by leaps and bounds. The ability to create lies and misinformation has grown by leaps and bounds. And so there's this balancing of the opportunities and the advantages of the ways in which social media and internet are used in advocacy and the real dangers as well, right? I do think when I think about it now, particularly when I talk to my own kids and to my colleagues who are coming up in the profession, that they are thinking with more of a social justice mind. So that I'm really happy to see that we are growing generations of people who are thinking large scale about disadvantage, inequity, the things that are important to them, the ways in which they want to see the world progress, and the ways in which they can advocate for that. So I think we're building those voices in ways that we weren't able to before, which is really, really great, and giving access sometimes to people who didn't have access to those spaces. So that's really great. I'm thinking about COVID when I think about this question, and watching people who maybe we didn't think of as traditional advocates become some of the strongest voices for the most vulnerable in our country. Watching health professionals speak very loudly about inequities around vaccine rollout, inequities around treatment, and talking about supporting disadvantaged communities. I worked a lot this year in Ontario with the Uninsured Network, which is a group of health professionals who pushed the province to be clear on coverage for healthcare for anyone in Ontario who's uninsured, who continue to push to make sure that vaccines will be rolled out to undocumented people. And it's incredible, right? And as I said sort of earlier, I'm also thinking about the legal profession. And I truly believe, and I will stand by this always, that as people in the legal profession, we can and we must do more to advance the inequities we see for disadvantaged communities. We have that ability to use advocacy to do that work. And I think we'll spend the rest of our time talking about some of those campaigns and the ways in which we all plug in to do that work.
I invite the rest of you to please jump in.
Maybe I'll start.
I think that sometimes, like, people like us, we're advocates or people in the academic world, we kind of live in our own bubble. Like, it's like here we are talking about anti-racist, history and all that kind of stuff. And I have to, in some way remind people that the vast majority of Canadians don't know what we're talking about. Like, honestly, last year, I've been doing a lot of webinars, like, because of the, rise of anti-Asian racism. So we got approached by like companies like, Sobeys, Sun Life, like, all these companies are now paying attention suddenly to the issue. So I have to talk about history of anti-racism, the head tax, exclusion act, very basic stuff that people actually do not know about. And I remember even way back when we finally got the parliamentary apology around that same time, there was a poll done by one of those institutes testing Canadians about their knowledge of history. Only about 30% had even heard of the Chinese Head Tax and Exclusion Act. And this is after 20 years of us working on the redress campaign. So I think we really have to remember that and to think about how do we make that more accessible. And that's why I think Shalini's point about, sort of teaching history, because right now it is in the curriculum, but it's up to the teacher to teach it or not, right? So, I mean, putting that point aside, and I think that really speaks to like, what is the new generation? Some of them are like really like they learn everything like online and everything. They know more about the history than I do, but then there are a whole bunch that don't know anything, right? So there's a big divide, a great divide. And even within law school, I'm sure a lot of the law students coming in have no idea of any of the things that we talked about until now, right? So, I mean, let's keep that in mind in terms of our advocacy. But at the same time, I also want to say that it's almost like the coronavirus or the COVID-19 give us now an opportunity for Asian Canadians anyways to talk about anti-Asian racism. And that opportunity was actually not there before, right? And people were not paying attention. But just because people were not paying attention doesn't mean that advocacy work had not been done. In fact, it has been done since the beginning of time. Like, even if you look at the history, people, Chinese Canadians and others have been bringing governments to court even way back then. So I think there is a very long history of resistance. We just need to remind people or uncover those histories, highlight that. And I think maybe the ways we do it are different now because of social media or whatnot. But I think the core really is more or less the same, right? It's like we try education, we try lobbying. If nothing else works, we go to the UN or you sue the government. So more or less the same formula, and more or less the same kind of people who are attracted to this kind of work will be doing the work. My hope is that as Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, COVID, anti-Asian racism, sort of spark more interest among people, and they are now more aware of the issue, then perhaps more people will become engaged. And at the same time, more the non-racialized Canadians will also start to question their own history as well.
If I can add something to this, I would say, I think sometimes too, if we can't dedicate our whole life to something, we don't know what to do. Like I can't do what Avvy's doing. I can't do what Toni's doing. Vincent's doing his PhD on this topic. So we do nothing. And I think there's a lot in between. And I want to talk a little bit about everyday activism. And the first thing I want to comment on something Shalini said, which is how we identify matters. So it's one thing that I say I'm Asian. It's another thing if I say my mom's from India, but I often say I'm Goan, which means I'm Catholic Indian, which means something different from Hindu Indian, which means something different from Sikh, which means something different from Muslim. So thinking about that as we think about cross-racial solidarity, what it means when we allow ourselves to be the racialized person chosen for the panel, because they need one racialized person and it gets to be an Asian, what it means that there's somebody that's not there. Where's the Black representation? Where's Indigenous representation? Are there Asian folks with accents that are different from Canadian accents represented? Who gets in and which accent? We need to think about that, and we need to do that work every day. I think what has shifted, and Shalini said it so beautifully, is I think the internet has opened up people's ability to access information so that they can be aware. It's caused some horrific results as well, and miseducation and violence and hatred, but there's an easier platform for us to access. And what I'm seeing is everybody in this year specifically getting excited about reading and learning. And what I want to call people to do is an everyday activism where you do the work. What does it mean to be on a hiring committee and think about who's not represented in your company, in your organization, in your NGO, at your table, in your academic circle? What does it mean to mentor somebody from a community that's different from yours? Saying, I've never mentored a young person from this community. Who do you mentor? We tend to mentor people exactly like us so we can make more of us where we are. What does it look like for me to look at who I work with and who I could bring in that's a partner that might bring a different perspective? How do we work in racial solidarity with queer communities, trans communities, folks with disabilities? How do all of these sites of oppression and folks who are underrepresented, how can we use our experience? I say, if you have felt excluded, if you have felt that you have not been heard, how can you channel that to say, how can I give more voice or more opportunities to other people? Because what I'm seeing is a lot of people posting and reading and not necessarily doing the work. And for everything from benchers to who's running our governments right now, if you're upset or happy with the premier, voting is not enough anymore, folks. It's not working. You need to start helping by actually not just saying, Shalini, run, but how can I help you, Shalini? What can I do? How many hours can I give? Can I knock on doors? Can I send emails? When people say to me, run for office, they say, how are you going to help me run? Because going to vote for 15 minutes of your day is not changing our countries. And we need to start doing the work, spending an hour a week. If you could do an hour a week to change something, I think it would make a bigger difference. And one of the things I want to leave people with is asking, why did you come here today? We're celebrating Asian history, but we're talking about anti-Asian racism. And I think a lot of what's bringing people to talk about it is exactly what Avvy said, is the violence that we're seeing. And so what makes us act when there's not heinous violence? Why do we care in the absence of that violence? Because there is violence happening every day, and we need to think about
that. Vincent, do you want to just say a few concluding words before we move to the Q&A section?
Yeah, real quick, I'll just shout out, it would just be a list of shout outs essentially but for really people who are mobilized and activated. I'm sure, like, some are already know and part, but some might want to jump in and participate in these organizations and spaces where this work is being done. So 3 categories of shout outs. I want to talk about, like, folks that are working on cross-racial coalition for building for racial justice, right? So, Color of Poverty, of course, Avvy and Shalini, and it's been tremendous sort of work that's been done, both data collection and advocacy. So look them up. Asians for Black Lives, right? Asians in Support for Wet'suwet'en. And these are sort of those organizations that are doing the everyday work to try to get around the constant stumbling blocks when you're trying to talk between, kind of racialized communities. The second category is sort of this new generation. Of course, none of this is new, right? Everything builds on stuff that has been done, but I'm just flagging a couple. But a new generation of really local, grassroots, radical Asian progressive entities, right? So CCNCTO is, I think one of them, Butterfly, Friends of Chinatown, Toronto, T-Base, Gabriella, Ontario, Migrante, Balve Collective, Chinese Canadian Collective out in Ottawa. So these are really, really kind of like localized community-based spaces where you don't, like, anybody who is interested can plug in, and it's really a community-based mobilization, community-based support, and they're doing, incredible work. Third one is, I guess, this is, this was kind of outlined by a great article by Tammy Kim on Columbia Journalism Review on transnationally Asian, right? So this new generation, because we have this incredible amount of information, you have this transnational kind of radical Asian identities, right? Entities, and tying kind of anti-oppressive politics to diaspora, right? In their localities and back, in the home country, right? So Anakbaya in Toronto does an amazing job doing this. Young Japanese Canadians of Toronto, they came together to put a transnational demonstration against immigration detention in Tokyo, right? And it happened in Toronto, right? Lausan Collective, which I'm part of, right, is kind of this decolonial Hong Kong diaspora formation. So I just want to put all of that out there, is that a lot of people are activated, they're doing the work, plug in, folks want to collaborate, and again, it doesn't matter what level you are on, everybody is like learning. So
thank you. I'd like to thank the panelists on behalf of everyone, Vincent, Toni, Avvy, and Shalini, for your wonderful observations and comments. In the remaining time, I'm turning the program over to the Asia Pacific Law Students Association at PULSA and their co-chairs, Annie and Ivy, who will be handling the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Justice Omatsu. So we'll jump into questions from the audience now and get through as many as we can in the time we have left. So a question that has come up a few times now is, what are some places to start looking and learning for people looking to help advocate against anti-Asian discrimination? And I know Vincent has already begun the list for us, but let's have the rest of our panelists share some resources now.
So I guess for the Chinese Canadian community in particular, I would also suggest the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, CCNCSJ. So they have a lot of information on their website. They took the lead in a number of these campaigns during the last year. If you want to learn more about history, then I would suggest going to our website, the roadtojustice.ca. That has a lot of kind of historical stuff as well.
Shalini and Toni, do you have any resources to share?
I'll just jump in on one, and it's a site called Act to End Racism. And they also collect data and have prepared a variety of very short videos which people can use, and they're excellent. Act to End Racism. It's a national organization of 40 organizations.
I also say to folks, attend these talks. And then if you hear about Chinese head tax and you're like, what don't I know about this? Then you go into Google and you type in a Chinese head tax and you start reading. And I think asking folks that are doing the work is helpful. I also think that everything that we've heard in terms of those organizations, but I find a first point of access for people will be listening to a TED Talk. It's something quick you can do in 10, 15 minutes, looking up TED Talks about these topics, listening to a panel that's at your university or in your community. And it can just open it up, because what I'm hearing from a lot of people is it's a lot. And when you start reading, it can feel very overwhelming. So start small, start watching. I remember reading the book Obasan about Japanese Canadian internment in Canada, and it really spiked an interest. And then I went from there. So start in a medium that you feel can be open to you and go from there. Shalini?
And just quickly to add that the work that the National Council of Canadian Muslims is doing, NCCM, has been really important. In particular, they're collecting the stories of Islamophobia in Canada. And we are currently having some very disturbing conversations and instances around anti-Muslim sentiment in Canada related to globally to what's happening between Israel and Palestine. And so I think checking out their website, checking out the way that they are collecting stories and trying to raise awareness of those issues is a great starting point too.
So thank you all of our panelists for all those amazing resources. We do have a request just to kind of share these into the chat box so the attendees can view them and look at them at a later time. So another interesting question that has come up, which I'm sure many of us have battled with dealing with the rise of anti-Asian racism, it's what are your thoughts on the regulation of hate speech versus just letting these voices come forward to be challenged? So there is a kind of concern that it's easier to just accept these voices that echo your own sentiments, because it's difficult to challenge other voices that have different ideas that are against what we believe. And we can start with anyone who would like to come forward.
I'll maybe start by just saying something that I think is important. We often talk about racial justice and ideas around equity in terms of who should speak up and when without talking about power. And I just want to acknowledge that the ways in which people are able to speak up and act will be dependent on their power, dependent on their job security. If my visa is tied to me being with this Canadian family, I may not have the same voice as I have as somebody who's a dean in a law school where I know my dean is aligned with my vision. So I also want to say that the ways in which you can speak up will be different based on your power. And that sometimes speaking up could cost you your job or could cost you an ability to work in the academia. And there are many courageous souls that have said, I don't care, I'm still going to speak up. But I want to recognize that that isn't an option for everybody. And so thinking about where you can do it and where you can build that strength. And I say, start doing it with your family. That is the first place that all of us see in our families. You know, you may be Asian and see Islamophobia on your family texting group. You may be at a dinner table and somebody saying something anti-Indigenous. You may hear somebody say, you know, my family's from India, and I hear a lot of things in India that are very anti-Chinese, right? That historic hostility exists in Canada and exists in those countries. And so I say start there, start in your book club, start in your community organization work. If you are working for a political campaign and you see that there's a lack of representation for different communities, start there. But I think part of how do you stop hate speech is also learning to develop that toolkit to know when you have power and what will work. And I also believe, especially when it's in a regulated profession, to not just vote, but to speak up and to help campaigns that stop this kind of racist promotion of initiatives.
Yeah, so thank you for centering the power discussion, Toni, because you're exactly right. And this question of hate speech and how to regulate and or legislate hate speech is really nuanced, and I think much more nuanced. I find the discussions now than I've ever seen them. Right? You know, Chi Tam, one of the organizers for Friends of Chinatown Toronto, in trying to get folks to sign up for Chinatown vaccinations, you know, recently, you know, Ancestral Street and have found, like, you know, vaccine hesitancy or whatever in racialized communities. That's not the issue. The issue is that information going to be shared with immigration? That's the number one issue. They want to know, you know, and you know, Graham Hudson and others are working on this, of course, as well. And it's not just in Asian communities, but that's like the number one fear. And so, okay, if that is like the number one fear in terms of getting access to vaccination or healthcare, then how can that be squared with the harm that is being done and the response, that the protection that we want from the harm that comes from like hate speech or hateful incidents, right? Is calling the police then the best way, right? Like how does that impact kind of different communities differently? I think that's a conversation that is like really being had at a very nuanced level now in the Asian community that I think I've never seen it before. And then also, if you could step back and think about hate speech as like a particular type of interpersonal harm, then are there community responses that we can do in terms of education, harm prevention, harm intervention, and harm redress that we can all do, that we don't necessarily need to outsource to a professionalized kind of, you know, force officials, right? That would be more transformative and better protect ourselves, right? And you know, of course, this is not a perfect response, sort of a bulletproof response in any way, but I think that is sort of the conversation that is starting to happen, that is happening, as well as, you know, whether or not to actually legislate it as, you know, criminal law or through like a human rights legislation or, you know, et cetera, et cetera.
I will also say, though, that Canada is really currently having a discussion on the regulation of online hate. And I think we have to be real, right? The Quebec mosque shooting that led to several deaths was because of the radicalization of someone based on online hate. And we continue to see online hate, and the result of that is violence against our communities, right? So we have to have a stark understanding that none of our freedoms have ever been absolute. They are always subject to regulation. And when the harm and the violence and the psyche of Asian communities, the emotional and psychological violence of that type of hate is so significant, we have to have real discussions in this country about regulating it. freedom of expression is an important freedom. I believe in it, but not when the damage of hateful speech is so significant that it is essentially destroying communities. We don't talk enough about the psychological damage to our entire community of these hates and the violence that is perpetrated based on that hate. So, I am a proponent of regulation. How do we balance it? A very difficult question, right? Who regulates it? How we balance it? Those are all difficult questions, but we cannot shy away from it. We cannot simply say, well, everyone has freedom of expression, so we have to let this go. That is not the answer.
So in our remaining time left, we have so many great questions flowing in, but we have a great one to end off on, which is, can you share your ideas about how to make this crucial work joyful in the absence of being able to gather in person? And let's have everyone just share a quick thought or two before we wrap up.
So example of joyful kind of activism, I guess. But before I say that, I absolutely agree with Shalini on the hate speech regulation. Example, like, Color Poverty did a video, like you should check out. It's called Go Ethnic Go. So we basically turned Michael Jackson's Beat It into Eat It as part of our campaign to point out at that time, like, one of the Jason Kenney was running for federal election and sort of like, talking about ethnic costumes as props for their election campaign. So, I mean, you could always find ways to make it fun, right? So, and even when you're talking about serious issue, like, don't take yourself seriously. The issue is serious, but don't take yourself so seriously.
I also want to say one of the things that has moved me in a lot of these discussions is our ancestors didn't fight and give up everything so that we could just survive. They did it so we could thrive. They did it so we could rejoice and have joy, so we could enjoy togetherness. And I think I was on a panel recently about this, and all of the folks on the panel about Asian culture talked about the focus on food. And we need to talk about that. We like to eat. We gather around food. Many cultures do this. I would say this is not always something that is aligned with what we call the Canadian culture, right? Which we generally mean non-racialized and non-Indigenous, by the way. But we gather around food and what it is to eat together and be together. And it's one of the things I've missed most in COVID is in every culture, we break bread. And so I think one of the ways you see it often in communities is, I could tell my mom I had lunch with Barack Obama, and my mom would say, "What did you eat?" Right? So what does it look like for us to come together and break bread and talk and rejoice about the work as well? And I think all of us, you could see us laughing when you even said it, it comes through in the work.
Totally agree with that. You're making me hungry. And also I was going to say, comedy is actually a brilliant way, and comedians do this all the time in the way they highlight very serious issues and crystallize it through comedy. I recently watched a video that I'll try to find about it was South Asians who were mispronouncing North American names. So it was a flip of what usually happens. And it's a topical issue in that we all have this frustration about the mispronunciation of our names, but the way in which they flipped it and sort of it really highlighted the issue in a different way. So I think comedy actually can be a brilliant tool for highlighting some of the things we've talked about. I'm a bit cringy about you trying to find that video that we did called Eat It. Thank you, Avvy, for bringing it up, but we'll try to find the post for you. But you have to be joyful when you're doing this work. If you sit in it and just take in all the hurt and the sadness and the trauma, it will really deflate you, right? And there is joy in the solidarity, there is joy in these types of discussions, and there's joy around the comedy of it that will really give you the energy that you want.
Thank you, Annie and Ivy. In the remaining few minutes, we'd like Dean Young to return and close this session. And thanks to everyone for all your wonderful contributions this morning.
Well, thank you all again for joining us today, and to the panelists. Vincent, Avvy, Shalini, Toni, and of course, Judge Omatsu, you have contributed powerfully to this really important dialogue on anti-Asian racism, discrimination, and violence. This is really an essential conversation and one that I hope will stay with all of us and encourage all of us to be activists and change makers. I'd like to invite everyone to join us while we watch a short video produced by our own Apalsa. But I'd also like to say before that, please consider donating to the Apalsa Leadership Award on the law school's giving page. I am so proud of our students for taking this initiative that will help our future students. And we've already gotten some donations and a couple from students already. So I'd really like to encourage you all to take our students' lead and contribute to this really worthwhile endeavor. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you to panelists. This was an absolutely riveting conversation and so very, very important. Thanks.
Asian Heritage Month to me is a celebration of all of the accomplishments that have been achieved.
To be curious, to be informed,
and commit to challenging racism and all forms of discrimination.
COVID-19, coupled with the media, acted as a catalyst that revealed the existing and rampant discrimination towards Asian communities. Now is the perfect opportunity to discuss diversity, prioritize the constitutional rights of various Asian heritages, and appreciate the many additions Asian Canadians have contributed to Canada's evolving landscape.
In Cantonese, there's an idiom, it means that you should pick one to be, or else you'll end up failing both. Growing up, I remember feeling really frustrated because I had to pick a side while knowing that whoever I chose would never truly accept me for who I was. I think that Asian Heritage Month is important to me because this is an experience we need to talk about.
Being a Canadian leader of Asian descent means being a bit of a sculptor. It means taking those clashing parts of the East and the West that live inside us and using our discernment to weave them into the unique and important perspectives that we can provide as people who occupy that in-between sort of space.
It's important to have Asian representation in leadership in the legal community because Asian people are very underrepresented in these areas. I think that being an Asian leader not only inspires others like you to strive for those opportunities, but it also helps counter stereotypes about Asian people, including the myth that their temperaments and values do not suit leadership roles.
Asian representation also means intersectionality and allyship. It means building awareness and taking action against not only the larger issues that plague our community, but microaggressions that happen day to day as well.
But also be the model leaders who create and refine the rules to protect those who are in disadvantage and help those who are in need.
So representation matters, visibility matters.
This Asian Heritage Month, let's let our voices be heard in celebration, in unity, and in a hopeful optimism as we continue to support Asian artists, Asian businesses, Asian communities, and Asian academics. Lastly, let's continue to build a society of respect and love between our other BIPOC brothers and sisters.